Hey, what's up everybody? My name's Brett Bodkins and I'm a photographer that mostly specializes in landscape photography. Today I'm going to share my Intro to Photography Basics class to help you guys who are looking to take control of your cameras. Some of you may ask why you would want to control a camera when you're paying so much for a fancy camera that should be able to do everything for you, including making the coffee. The truth is that even the most expensive cameras cannot gauge what you want creatively in a photo, and they cannot be prepared for every situation. I don't want you to get too hung up on the math behind things, but instead understand the concepts first and start to memorize and understand the numbers as time goes on. The first thing I want to show you is what I'm going to refer to as the exposure scale. You have two extreme scenarios to look for. The first is a photo that comes out completely white. This means that you put too much light onto the sensor. The opposite situation is an all-black photo that didn't get enough light into the camera. We call this over and under exposure respectively. In the middle you have a complete grayscale of different intensities. Your camera is set to try to take a photo at a particular shade of gray on the scale to give an adequately exposed photograph every time. The problem is that you don't always want that neutral gray. Sometimes you want something a little more biased toward white, what we call high key, or a darker image, what we call low key. So even on a fancy automatic camera, you need to know what the camera's meter is trying to accomplish and hopefully know of a way to manipulate its behavior to get the desired effect in your photo. The first step toward this in an automatic mode is a function we call exposure compensation, where you can basically push the camera to meter over or underexposed while still letting the camera take control of the settings. Some of you will be happy to stop there, and for the rest of us, it's time to learn to take control of our camera's manual adjustments. Not all modern cameras allow you to take manual control over the camera's settings, and these cameras may not be suitable for serious photography. It doesn't have to be expensive to find a camera that will allow you to control everything yourself, especially if you're open to using a film camera instead of digital. To help you understand how to control a camera's settings, you first need to know that there are only 3 settings used to determine exposure. The 3 settings are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. These settings must be in balance with the other 2. If you change one, you must also shift another to maintain that balance. You can begin to see that relationship in the exposure triangle graphic shown here. We will get into this balancing act later, but first I want to explain what each of these settings are and what they mean. The first setting I want us to look at is ISO. Basically, ISO is a camera's sensitivity to light. It works much like a volume knob on a stereo. In film photography, the ISO was set by which film you bought. Different films were produced with varying sensitivities to light. Some were so sensitive that you could use them indoors, while others could only be shot outside in bright sunlight. In analog photography, once you put the film in your camera, the ISO was set to the speed of that film, and you only had to pay attention to the other 2 settings, shutter speed and aperture. Digital cameras, however, allow you to change the ISO at any time, and this makes it easier to shoot in any lighting conditions, though slightly more challenging to understand and control the process. There is a trade-off to turning up the ISO on a camera, and that is the increase of noise in your images. We've all seen this phenomenon when we've taken digital photos in low light settings without a flash. It is especially visible in the darker areas of the image as seen here. Some cameras handle higher ISOs better than others, and as a general rule, newer cameras tend to look better than cameras made even 5 years ago, as seen in this comparison between my current camera and the one it replaced. This is an image shot on my Nikon D500 at ISO 51,200, which is insanely high and much higher than many other cameras will even allow. This camera shoots at higher ISOs better than most other cameras on the market right now. However, ideally you will keep the ISO settings down as low as possible and you'll be able to see big improvements, as you can see in this image shot at ISO 100 on the same camera. One thing I want you to understand about automatic modes in regard to choosing settings is that the camera will try to find the simplest way to achieve its desired exposure result. It doesn't care what aperture setting or shutter speed setting it uses unless you move into a mode that controls those functions. Oftentimes the easiest way to achieve a photo will be for the camera to raise the ISO, and it will do so regardless of the hit to image quality. Learning how to harness the ISO settings in your camera will improve your images dramatically. The next setting we're going to look at is the shutter speed control. Basically what we're talking about here is the camera's ability to either take a very brief exposure or longer exposures depending on your creative needs for the image. Obviously, the shorter the exposure is, the less light that will reach the sensor, and you will need to compensate one of the other two settings to make up for that. The inverse is also true of longer exposures as well. A fast shutter speed may be as quick as 1/8,000th of a second, and a slow shutter speed may even be many minutes long depending on what you're trying to capture. Of course, longer exposures will require a tripod, as you won't be able to hold the camera still handheld for very long. If you don't have or don't want to carry a tripod, you will have to limit yourself to speeds faster than approximately 1/60th of a second, depending on how heavy your camera is and the lens you're using at the time. This will also limit your options on the other settings necessary to counterbalance your shutter speed choice. The general rule of thumb is that you will need a tripod for low light work and is generally used for landscape photography but not necessary for portrait photography. Your shutter speed choice is generally made by your need to either freeze movement in the photo or your desire to include motion blur in an image. You will need to assess the speed of the movement to get a desired result. You will get better at this over time, but it's important to understand how fundamental the setting is to your creative decisions about your photograph. Of course, your shutter speed will inadvertently affect the image exposure as well. So now we move to the third and final setting that controls exposure. The aperture is an adjustable mechanical diaphragm in the camera lens that allows you to control the amount of light entering the lens. It works much like the pupil of your eye in that it can expand to allow more light in or contract to limit the amount of light hitting the sensor. This is a very useful way to control the amount of light needed for an exposure. So we've now touched on all three elements needed to adjust the exposure of your images: the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. We will get back to the final understanding of the exposure triangle when we finish understanding the other thing that happens when you adjust the aperture. When you adjust the aperture, in addition to affecting the exposure, you are also adjusting the amount of the image that is in focus. This is called your depth of field. Notice that the larger the f number, the smaller the aperture is. This is because the number is actually a fractional number. At wider apertures, your depth of field is shallower, and at smaller apertures, your depth of field is wider. You can see this in the handy aperture chart shown here. This is an oversimplification of the principle, and there are a few other factors, but this is the general idea. At wider apertures, you will have an out-of-focus area behind your subject as well as in front of your subject. There are some variables to do with distance between the camera and the subject being focused upon, as well as the focal length of the lens being used. This is probably one of the harder concepts in photography to grasp, but in the spirit of keeping things simple, I'm going to show you a couple photo examples of what photos shot at wider apertures look like. As you can see, there are areas both in front of and behind the subject that have been rendered out of focus. On wide aperture shots, this focused area may only be an inch wide, whereas when you shoot with a narrow aperture, then the entire shot could be in focus. Now that you're beginning to understand how to control your settings manually, I wanted to explain the different exposure modes and when you may want to use one or another. Most modern serious cameras have a fully manual mode where you can control all three functions yourself to get the most accurate results. You will get faster at this over time, and in some shooting situations you may not be in any hurry. In other situations, time may be of the essence. It's important to learn to understand what your camera is trying to do anytime you allow it to take control of a function. The very first automatic mode that came out on early cameras had you control the aperture, and the camera would calculate the shutter speed based on the amount of light coming into it. Later, other manufacturers added a mode that did the opposite. You controlled the shutter speed, the camera would calculate the aperture for you. We now refer to these modes as aperture priority and shutter priority modes. These modes can be a much quicker way to work in some circumstances. Oftentimes there is an auto ISO function that can be used in any of the modes we talked about here, but it's important to set it up beforehand and know what it's going to do to your images. So now that we have covered all three settings, we need to learn how to use them in the field. At one time, all film photography was done without any light meters to base your settings off of. They had all kinds of math to do to come up with the settings they would need, and once they gained experience doing the calculations, they could start to get pretty good guesses off the top of their heads. After a while, they came up with a rule that could help them get a good daytime exposure calculation that they could then modify from there to come up with the type of shot they really wanted creatively. This rule designated that you could set your aperture based on the current lighting conditions and then set your shutter speed at the reciprocal to the ISO setting. So for example, if your ISO was 100, the shutter speed would be set at 1/125th of a second, and they ended up naming this the Sunny 16 rule. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, the shutter speeds don't line up exactly with the reciprocal numbers, so you just have to get as close as possible. For each number you move on the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture scales, you effectively double the amount of light or cut it in half depending on which way you adjust on the scale. Each time you do this, it is referred to as a stop of light. At any time, you can subtract one stop of light from one setting and add one stop to another, and you will come up with the same resulting exposure. For example, you could subtract 4 stops on your ISO, and you can add 2 to the shutter speed and 2 to the aperture to come up with the same correct exposure to make an image. We're going to start with an example and show you how to adjust your settings in different situations, but in this example we're going to ignore the camera's built-in light meter. It's a bright sunny day, so we're going to start with the Sunny 16 rule I described earlier. Now let's say you're walking and shooting at these settings. As long as the light stays the same, you could shoot for hours, but let's say that it becomes slightly overcast. As described earlier, we can open the lens aperture to compensate for the one stop of light we lost. So let's say it happens again and becomes even more overcast. We open the aperture to f8 now to let even more light onto the film. So now let's imagine that you see someone on a bicycle that you want to include in the shot. You notice that the shutter speed on 1/125th of a second will probably make the bicyclist blurry if you take his photo. You decide that you need to change to 1/500th of a second in order to make him sharp in the image. This is a negative 2 stop adjustment, and you're going to need to adjust something else to gain that light back. You decide to go for 2 stops faster on the aperture setting, thus opening it up to f4. You take the shot and continue to walk. Now you see someone you'd like to take a portrait of and decide you want the background out of focus. So you decide you're going to take the shot at f2. You need 2 stops less light to fix the exposure. The shutter speed is at 1/500th, which is already fast enough to stop any movement that the subject may make, but your camera goes all the way up to 1/8000th of a second. So you adjust the camera to 1/2000th of a second and take the portrait. Now you're walking along and you see a waterfall that you want to take a picture of and decide that you want everything in focus, but you also want the water to be frozen in time. You want to be able to see the drops of water and the mist in the image. You know you're going to want the aperture at a minimum of f8, but you're going to need all the light you can get, so you go with that minimum value of f8. That leaves you negative 4 stops of light short of a good exposure. You decide that you're going to have to raise the ISO to get a good exposure. You can divide that 4 stops between the ISO and the shutter speed, but since you want the water frozen, you decide to shoot with the ISO at 1600 and hope that the digital noise isn't too bad when you look at the images later. Better yet, since you're shooting digital, you could take an image both ways and see which one is better. There are a couple ways to manipulate light even further to allow even more exposure possibilities. The first, as I mentioned earlier, is to use a tripod to allow longer exposure times. The second is the use of neutral density filters, which are glass filters that cut the amount of light that come through them. The effect is to cut light without affecting the colors in the image. This allows you to do longer exposures than you could do otherwise without them, or allows you to open the aperture further for a shot where reduced depth of field is desired. I hope that this intro to photography exposure video will help you guys understand how to control your camera on your own, and also how to use the automatic modes, knowing what the camera is going to want to do and how to manipulate its behavior to your advantage. I spent a long time trying to create this video in a way that would present the information in the simplest possible way, clearly and quickly. If you found this video helpful, please share it with any of your friends who would like to take control of the photography process, as it can be very hard for a beginner on YouTube to get their videos seen. Thanks so much and good luck in your photography endeavors.